I am the history kid. I don't have a degree in history, but I love history. And if you love history too, this could be the channel for you.
Flying ace Eddie Rickenbacker was a World War I hero, but his heroics during the Second World War are not as well known. This is a story of survival, perseverance, of the true nature of heroism, and deserves to be remembered. Eddie Rickenbacker's rambunctious childhood included several accidents and near misses that might explain his fearless nature and taught him to endure hardship. His father died when Eddie was just 13, so he quit school to support his family. He became a car salesman and then a famous race car driver, driving 4 times in the Indianapolis 500 back when the raceway was paved with bricks and the raceway had no lights, so they had to finish before dark. He joined the Army in 1917 after the U.S. joined World War I. He wanted to fly and thought race car drivers would be excellent pilots because they were used to confined spaces and going fast. After earning a place in the famed 49th Aero Squadron, he scored 26 verified aerial victories and more decorations for valor than any other American in the war. In 1922, he married a woman named Adelaide, who was described as volcanic, a trait that would help Rickenbacker in the future. After the war, he was a successful man, starting a company that sold the first cars equipped with 4-wheel braking systems. He purchased and operated the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and then he founded Eastern Airlines, for which he was president for more than 30 years. But there's a chapter of his extraordinary life that is almost forgotten. In 1942, at the age of 52, the Secretary of War asked him to report on the U.S. Air Force units stationed in the Pacific Theater. Always eager to serve his country, Rickenbacker and his aide, Colonel Hans Edmondson, took off from Hawaii in a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the most iconic aircraft of the Second World War and the 3rd most produced bomber aircraft of all time. The B-17 carried Rickenbacker, Edmondson, 5 crewmen, and a serviceman who was returning to his unit after recovering from an illness. 8 men in total. An hour before their landing, the pilot began their descent, looking for their destination, Canton Island, but they never saw it. Navigating aircraft is difficult, especially over open water. Before computers and GPS, aircraft would use a device called a bubble octant that pilots the aircraft's course based on its relationship to a celestial body. A rough takeoff could jar the instrument, making them miss their destination by many miles. In fact, navigational error was common and a very real threat to any aircrew at the time. The crew tried to locate their position. They were in radio contact with Canton and asked them to fire off anti-aircraft guns that would show their position. Search planes were dispatched. Another island was able to determine their compass heading by the radio signal, but couldn't determine a bearing. Desperately, the crew tried to look for a ship that might help them determine their location, but there were none. As the airplane ran low on fuel, the 8 men prepared to ditch the airplane in the open Pacific, with no idea of their location for rescue. They threw out anything not needed for survival to lighten the plane. They stacked emergency rations and water near the hatch, where they would be easiest to grab. They donned life jackets and prepared the 3 life rafts. As the airplane neared the water, the ocean swells were high. The pilot put the heavy airplane down as well as he could, but it was still very rough. All 7 were injured, and the plane was sinking quickly. 6-foot waves made it tricky to board the rafts. 2 of the 3 rafts were supposed to hold 5 men each, but Rickenbacker later argued that the person who said it fit 5 should be forced to test his theory at sea. The larger raft was set just 5 feet by 9 feet, and the 3 men could hardly tuck into them. In the chaos of the crash, they tried to find water and supplies, but they were gone. For food, they only had some oranges that the pilot had stuffed in his pockets. They had few supplies, hand pumps and repair kits for the raft, a first aid kit, a flare gun, and 2 pistols. They had a couple fishing lines with hooks, but nothing for bait. Rickenbacker had managed to save 60 feet of line from the airplane, which allowed them to tether the rafts together. But the tight open rafts were terrible. The sun and heat blistered during the day, and soaked by seawater, they were freezing at night. The men tried using orange peels to bait the fishing lines with no luck. They hoped to shoot a seagull with one of the pistols, but none came close. The pistols rusted and became useless. For the first 6 days, the 8 men shared just 4 oranges. A miracle came on the 8th day as Rickenbacker rested. A seagull literally landed on his face. He managed to grab its legs and kill it. They finally had a bit of food and used the bird's intestines as bait for the fishing lines, and immediately started catching fish. It rained, and they used collapsible buckets that were included with the rafts to collect fresh water. But the army sergeant who had been recovering from an illness before the trip died on their 13th day at sea. The shortage of food and water continued. Occasionally they got fish or some water from rain, but their health was declining. They tried putting 3 strongest into a raft to see if they could row against the current, but it was just too strong. A few times they saw planes in the distance, but were unable to flag them down. On the 20th day, they finally split up, sending the 3 rafts different directions in hope of finding land. Rickenbacker was left with the 2 sickest men, including his friend Admundson, who was near death. With no food and little water, the situation was dire. The next day, Rickenbacker tried to get both men water, but they were too weak to even lift their heads. The end for all 3 seemed near, when suddenly 2 Navy float planes flew over the raft. The planes turned and flew close enough that it was clear that they had seen them. One returned to land and rescued them. It turns out a patrol had spotted the small raft with a pilot who pointed them in the direction of Rickenbacker's raft. Then, they got news on the radio that 3 downed airmen had been found on a desert island, the crew of the other life raft. Astoundingly, they were all alive. After the rescue, Rickenbacker learned that he had miscounted days. They'd been at sea 23 days, not 21, making it a world record for survival in an open raft at the time. Through it all, the World War I ace was their leader. Rickenbacker kept their spirits up, demanding that they would have a group prayer session every night, and when encouragement didn't work, he would browbeat or berate them for giving up. He was apparently so forceful that the rest of them made a pact that they were going to survive, if only to outlive him. His strength helped to keep them alive, a type of heroism that's much different than shooting down airplanes in the First World War. After the ordeal, Rickenbacker continued on to complete that inspection of the Pacific Army Air Forces and provide his report. As for his wife, after 2 weeks the Army had decided to give up on the 8 men and declared them dead. It was Adeline Rickenbacker who pressed them to continue searching, a move that likely saved their lives. The 2 traveled together extensively after Eddie retired in 1963. Eddie Rickenbacker died of a heart attack in 1973 at the age of 82. He and Adelaide had been married for 51 years.
Hi, I'm the History Guy, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Kids, which is inspired by my channel, The History Guy. History deserves to be remembered. Be sure to subscribe for more episodes.